Dear students, the topic I'm going to explain today is a very simple one. It is about the different portals of entry of pathogens in human body. That means, what are the various routes or openings through which a pathogen can enter and can cause infection. The definition for this term, portal of entry, is the site through which a microorganism enters the susceptible host and cause disease or infection. The four common entry points in the human body are skin, gastrointestinal tract, respiratory tract, and urogenital tract. Most commonly, a specific pathogen will be adapted to enter a particular port of entry. And this adaptation is so restrictive that if it enters through any other site, it cannot cause the infection. I'll tell you an example for this. You take influenza virus, which causes flu. When this influenza virus enters through the nasal route, that is through the nose, it causes the disease flu. Whereas if it enters through skin, then it cannot cause the infection. So that is what I mean by saying that the portal of entry is restricted for a particular pathogen. But occasionally, an infective agent can enter by more than one portal. For example, if you take Mycobacterium tuberculosis, it enters through both the respiratory tract and gastrointestinal tract and can cause the infection in both these places. And there is one more point you need to remember. Some of the pathogens which have more than one portal of entry can cause two different types of diseases. For example, take Staphylococcus aureus. This can enter through skin or through the respiratory tract. When it infects the skin, it usually causes abscess, what we commonly call boil. But if it enters through the respiratory tract, then it can cause pneumonia. Let's first see how the organisms enter through skin. The first entry point. See, usually the smooth, unbroken or undamaged skin will be totally protective. Microbes cannot usually invade such a healthy skin. But if there is some kind of a disturbance on the surface of the skin, then organisms can easily enter and cause infection and disease. So how this damage takes place, that is what you are going to see here in 4 points. First one is any nick or abrasions or punctures that happens during some kind of an accident. You might be falling down or you will be meeting with an accident. So in such times, when the upper layer of the skin gets damaged, when it gets nicks or abrasions, then through those routes organisms can enter. So the usual organisms which enter by this way have been mentioned here. It is Staphylococcus aureus, Streptococcus pyogenes, fungal dermatophytes, and also Clostridium tetani. If you see these organisms, Staph aureus and Strep pyogenes, they are actually the normal flora which will be present on the skin surface. But when skin layer gets disturbed, they can easily enter the deeper layers and can cause the infection. And Clostridium tetani spores, as I already mentioned, will be present in the soil. So when you come into contact with the soil containing these spores, the spores can easily enter these punctured areas, these affected areas. The spores will germinate, giving rise to vegetative cells, leading to infection. So this is the first way of infection in skin. The second is, there are some infectious agents which create their own passages into the skin by secreting certain digestive enzymes. For example, if we talk about the fungal dermatophytes again, dermatophytes even in a normal skin they can cause infection. How? They secrete certain enzymes, digestive enzymes. For example, here I have mentioned keratinase enzyme. This enzyme digests the main component in the skin. We know this main component in the skin is keratin protein. So these enzymes release keratinase enzyme. They will hydrolyze the keratin protein, and thereby they can easily enter into the deeper layers of the skin. The third way of entry into the skin is some infectious agents enter through bites. Bites that is caused by either insects or ticks or other animals like cats and dogs. So when such animals and insects bite the surface of the skin, naturally the upper layer will get damaged, and through which the organisms can easily enter. Sometimes the organism might be entering from the surrounding environment, or the organisms might be entering from the biting animal itself. From its saliva itself, the organisms will enter. Many viruses enter this way. For example, dengue virus enters through mosquito, right? And Rickettsia bacteria enters through this way. Protozoan parasites like malarial parasite Plasmodium enters by insect bite. Okay, so by the bites of animals and insects also, organisms enter through skin and cause infection. Last but not the least, there are certain artificial ways by which the skin barrier gets breached, gets damaged, organisms enter. How? By the use of hypodermic needles, which is usually used by intravenous drug abusers. See, I am not talking about the hypodermic needles or syringe and needles used by the doctors and nurses, because they usually use sterile disposable needles. What I am talking here is the needles that are used by drug users, drug abusers. ಡ್ರಗ್ಸ್ ತಗೊಳ್ತಾರಲ್ಲ, ಅವ್ರು ಏನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ ಅಂದ್ರೆ, ಒಬ್ಬರು ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಆ ನೀಡಲ್ನ ಇನ್ನೊಬ್ಬರಿಗೆ ಶೇರ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾರೆ. ಸೊ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಒನ್ ಪರ್ಸನ್ ಟು ಅನದರ್ ಪರ್ಸನ್, organisms can easily get transferred through skin. So very well-known diseases that has been transferred by these drug abusers is hepatitis virus, serum hepatitis virus, and also HIV, which causes AIDS. So the blood gets mixed up here from one person to another person when they share needles. Gastrointestinal tract as the portal of entry. Usually the organisms enter the gastrointestinal tract through contaminated food or contaminated water and other ingested substances. And when the organisms enter the gastrointestinal tract, remember that they will face a lot of resistance in our body. For example, right from the mouth region, where different types of digestive enzymes, antimicrobials are present. Later on, they will go to the stomach where acidic pH is present. So all these are going to restrict the microorganisms to the maximum. They will kill the microorganisms to the maximum. But if a microorganism causes an infection, even after all these adverse environment, then it is understood that they are adapted to such an environment. They are adapted to acidic pH. They are adapted to abrupt pH changes, because in the mouth there will be alkaline pH, in the stomach there will be acidic pH. Again, when it goes to the intestine, there will be alkaline pH. So there will be abrupt pH changes. So the pathogens, gastrointestinal pathogens, usually would have been adapted to all these abrupt pH changes. And not only that, intestine, as you know, contains lot of digestive enzymes. So they should be protected from all this. So naturally they will have all these protective coatings to prohibit the digestive enzymes from killing them. Next, you need to know about this is, most of these enteric pathogens, we call them as enteric pathogens, the organisms which cause infection in the gastrointestinal tract. So most of these enteric pathogens, they have some specialized mechanisms, not only for entering but also for localizing in the mucosa of small or large intestine. See, this is one area where the fecal material will keep on getting flushed out of the body every day. So if at all these enteric pathogens have to cause the infection, then they must be having a mechanism to strongly attach themselves to the small or large intestine. So they will have appendages on their surface which will help them to attach to the intestinal region. So fimbri ಅಂತ ನೋಡಿರ್ತೀರಾ, capsules ಅಂತ ನೋಡಿರ್ತೀರಾ. All these are going to help them to attach the enteric pathogens on the intestinal tract. Now these are some examples which usually cause infection through the gastrointestinal tract. I have mentioned some bacteria, some viruses, and also protozoans. Among bacteria, very common enteric pathogens are gram-negative rots. So under this we have Salmonella species, Shigella species. Salmonella causes typhoid, you may be knowing already. Shigella causes bacillary dysentery, or you can call it as shigellosis. Vibrio causes cholera, and certain strains of Escherichia coli. E. coli, we call them as normal microflora, but some strains of E. coli also can act as enteric pathogens. So all these are about bacteria, whereas among viruses, the most common enteric viruses are enteroviruses or poliovirus, hepatitis A virus, ecovirus, and rotavirus. Whereas among protozoans, the common protozoan parasites that cause intestinal disease include Entamoeba histolytica, which causes amoebic dysentery or amoebiasis. See, this causes amoebic dysentery, whereas Shigella causes bacillary dysentery. Both are gastrointestinal infections, but only depending on the organism that is involved, we are going to give them different names. We call this as amoebic dysentery, whereas we call this as bacillary dysentery. And another organism, another protozoan is Giardia lamblia, which causes giardiasis. Next is the respiratory portal of entry. This portal of entry is for the greatest number of pathogens, and when organisms cause respiratory infection, they might be entering either through the oral route, that is through mouth, or to the nasal route, that is through nose. So both these organisms can cause respiratory infections. And usually how deep they go inside the respiratory tract depends on their size. The small cells and small particles which are inhaled more deeply than the larger ones, they can even enter the lower respiratory tract and can cause infection. And there are two important infections that you will see in the respiratory tract. One is the upper respiratory infection, the other one is the lower respiratory tract infection. Upper respiratory tract infections are usually not very serious. It will be basically cough and cold, fever, sinusitis, all this you will see, pharyngitis, laryngitis, all this you will see, inflammations. Whereas if the organism enters the lower respiratory tract, then it becomes a serious type of infection, which we call pneumonia. These are the common organisms that cause infection through the respiratory tract. First one, bacteria. The most common bacterial agents that enter through nasal cavity include Streptococcus pyogenes, which causes streptococcal sore throat, Neisseria meningitidis, which causes meningitis, Corynebacterium diphtheriae, which causes diphtheria, and Bordetella pertussis, which causes whooping cough. Now, as I said, if they enter the lower respiratory tract, they cause pneumonia. So some of the very common bacteria that cause pneumonia include Streptococcus pneumoniae, Klebsiella, and Mycoplasma. If you see these organisms which I mentioned, most of them are actually normal microflora. They will be present in these respiratory regions without causing any infection, but if they get a chance, if the immune system of the body gets lowered by some reason, then they will cause the infection. Now, if you see again, these infections are not restricted to the respiratory tract alone. If you see all these infections, since this respiratory tract is connected to various other regions of our upper body, for example, sinuses are connected, auditory tubes are connected, brain is connected. So sometimes when the infection happens in the respiratory tract, that infection can get spread to other parts of this upper part of the body and can cause infection there also. Among the viruses, the most common viruses that enter through respiratory tract are influenza, measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, and common cold. Again, I would like to mention one more thing here. See, these infections, though they might enter through one particular entry point, they need not have to be present in that region alone. They can get spread to other parts of the body also. They need not have to be a localized infection. They can become a systemic infection. For example, you know chickenpox. The organism might be entering through the respiratory tract, but you will see the effect throughout your body, right? So that also is possible, and you should remember as far as portal of entry is concerned. And the common fungi are Cryptococcus and Pneumocystis. Again, these two fungi, they usually cause infection in a immunocompromised individual. That is the person who has lower immune uh, machinery. In such people, these infections are commonly seen, especially in AIDS patients. You will see this infection, both cryptococcosis and Pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. We call it as PCP in short. So this also, Pneumocystis also causes pneumonia. So we call it as Pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. So both these infections are commonly seen in AIDS patients as secondary infections. And of course, as I said, organisms like Mycobacterium tuberculosis and Histoplasma. Histoplasma is a fungi again. So these mainly cause disease in the lower respiratory tract, and the disease will be usually very severe. And as I already mentioned, these diseases need not have to be restricted only in the respiratory tract alone. From this region, they can move to other parts of the body and cause a very severe infection in other regions also. The next one is urogenital portal of entry, both urinary tract and genital tract. Usually through this route, the organisms are contracted by sexual means, that is by sexual intercourse. The organisms will enter these routes, and that is why it is also called the disease itself is called sexually transmitted disease or venereal disease. This was a very old term, venereal disease, but nowadays it has been replaced by sexually transmitted disease or STDs. And the microbes usually enter this region through the skin or mucosa of penis, external genitalia, vagina, cervix, and urethra. See, if you carefully observe the lower part of the body, there are three openings. The first one is the urethral opening through which the urine is passed. The second one, the middle one, is the vaginal opening through which the sexual intercourse is done. And the last opening is the anus through which the fecal material comes out. Okay, and infection usually happens in the first two routes, that is the urethral opening and also the vaginal opening. And from this route, during sexual intercourse, the organism will also enter the cervix. Cervix is the region between the uterus and the vagina. See, we know vagina is the passage which is going to face the external genitalia, right? So vagina matte uterus. Uterus is the bag where the fetus is carried, right? So in uterus bag matte vaginal passage madhyadalli ಒಂದು small narrow region ಇದೆ, and that is called cervix. So ಇಲ್ಲೂ ಕೂಡ infection ಆಗುತ್ತೆ, usually sexual intercourse ಇಂದ ಈ regionally infection ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. And even in the penis, skin of the penis, the infection happens from a female to a male. Fine. And some can penetrate an unbroken surface, others require a cut or abrasion. See, most of the times organisms, as soon as they get lodged on these mucosal regions, ಅದು vagina ಇರಲಿ, urethra ಇರಲಿ, ಇಲ್ಲ cervix ಇರಲಿ, as soon as they enter these mucosal regions, they have their own mechanisms to penetrate these mucosal surfaces and enter the deeper tissues and cause the infection. But some organisms are so delicate that they need again, in those mucosal openings, they need again some kind of a damage through which they can easily enter and cause the infection. Fine. So we will see example later. I will just finish with this. And not all urogenital infections are sexually transmitted diseases. This also I must say. Why? Because some of these infections are caused by displaced organisms. For example, a normal flora from a gastrointestinal tract can cause urinary tract infection. ಅದು ಸೆಕ್ಷುವಲ್ ಇಂಟರ್ಕೋರ್ಸ್ ಆಗಿನೇ ಆ ರೀಜಿಯನ್ಗೆ ನಿಮಗೆ ಇನ್ಫೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಆಗಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಏನೂ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಎಂಡೋಜಿನಸ್ ಇನ್ಫೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತೀವಲ್ಲ, ನಾರ್ಮಲ್ ಫ್ಲೋರಾ ಫ್ರಮ್ ದ ಗ್ಯಾಸ್ಟ್ರೋಇಂಟೆಸ್ಟೈನಲ್ ಟ್ರ್ಯಾಕ್ಟ್ ಕ್ಯಾನ್ ಎಂಟರ್ ದ ಯುರಿನರಿ ಟ್ರ್ಯಾಕ್ಟ್, which is not normal site for it, and it will start infection in that region. Or sometimes because of some disturbances in the pH or in the nutrient content in these regions, suddenly an organism will start overgrowing and cause an infection. For example, candida infections, ee tara agutte, yeast infections. So among the bacteria which causes infection in the urogenital tract, very common ones are Treponema pallidum, which causes syphilis, and Neisseria gonorrhea, which causes gonorrheal disease. As I said, for some organisms, they are so delicate that they need some cut or abrasion in the mucosal surface, and only then they can cause the infection. Syphilis is, the Treponema is such an organism which is very delicate, so it needs some damage in the skin by means of which it can cause the infection. Where Neisseria gonorrhea usually causes infection in the cervical region, and it causes inflammation in that region. And why among viruses, of course, HIV, through sexual intercourse, this organism can easily cause infection in the vaginal region, and from there it can enter the blood, and from there it can get spreaded throughout the body. And serum hepatitis, which is caused by hepatitis B virus. See, I repeat this, there are two important viruses I have been telling till now as far as hepatitis is concerned. One is hepatitis A, the other one is hepatitis B. Hepatitis A virus gets spreaded through contaminated water. When you consume it, it will cause infection in the intestinal tract. Whereas hepatitis B gets spreaded through contaminated blood or serum. So they will usually cause liver infection through they will reach the liver from the blood, and then they cause the infection. So blood ge barabeku antadre, they might either get entered through infected needles, or they might enter through infected blood or through sexual intercourse. So don't get confused. There are two viruses I have been telling about as far as hepatitis is concerned. The third group is protozoan parasites. Among this, a very common sexually transmitted diseases, trichomoniasis, caused by Trichomonas vaginalis. And the last one is yeast infections like vaginal candidiasis, caused by again a normal flora which you will observe in the vaginal tract, that is Candida albicans. ಇದೇನೋ ಹೊಸದು ಸೇರಿಸ್ಬಿಟ್ಟಿದಾರಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ನೋಡ್ತಿದ್ದೀರಾ? I purposefully did not mention it in the first slide. There is another portal of entry which is very special in its nature, that is transplacental entry. Inside the body itself, there is another entry point through which a pathogen can enter, not the human body but the fetus body. The fetus that is present inside the maternal womb or the maternal uterus can get infected, and that that happens usually through the placenta. So we also should be talking about the transplacental entry when we talk about portals of entry. So we know that placenta is ordinarily an effective barrier against microorganisms in the maternal circulation. This is the placental tissue that you are seeing, which has some of the tissue is from the fetus, whereas some of the tissue is from the mother. And placenta is a very protective layer. Most of the microorganisms will be inhibited from entering inside this region because of this placenta. But sometimes the placenta itself will become a route of entry for certain microorganisms, especially viruses. Okay, so some microbes can cross the placenta. They will cross this tissue. They will cross the placenta. They will reach the umbilical cord or umbilical vein, and from there they will enter the fetal circulation, and from there they will start spreading to various tissues of the fetus. So the infections that usually happens in the fetus can be called in a cluster by the name starch. What is starch? That is S, which stands for syphilis, which is caused by Treponema pallidum. Next is T, that is, it stands for toxoplasmosis infection caused by Toxoplasma gondii. Then others, O stands for other infections like hepatitis B, HIV, AIDS, and also chlamydia infection. R stands for rubellosis caused by rubella. C stands for cytomegalovirus infection, and H stands for herpes simplex virus infection. So these are the most common infections that happens through transplacental route in the fetus. Okay, that's all for today. Yen assignment kodona. Fine. What you do is you find out any 10 pathogens which have more than one portal of entry. Write the name of the pathogen, the disease it causes, and also its portals of entry. Okay. Thank you.